The Tower of London, summer of 1483. Two boys play in the gardens within the fortress walls. The older one is 12, and technically he's the King of England. Edward V, crowned in name, if not yet in ceremony, waiting in the royal apartments for the coronation that will make his kingship official. The younger is 9, Richard, Duke of York, with the easy confidence of a child who has never known real hardship. They're princes, they're brothers. And though they may not fully understand it yet, they're prisoners. People see them that summer, servants and guards, officials going about their business. The boys are spotted shooting arrows at targets, running through the grounds, and appearing at the windows of the royal apartments to watch the world outside the walls. These sightings continue through June and into July. Then, gradually, they become less frequent. The boys appear at the windows less often. The garden stands empty more days than not. Sometime in late summer, the sightings stop entirely. No announcement accompanies their disappearance. No official word from the crown, no funeral, no explanation. One week, people glimpse them at the windows. The next week, nothing. The princes have simply ceased to appear. Where did they go? For 540 years, no one has been able to answer that question with certainty. And in the last 2 years, new evidence has emerged that has reignited the debate, pointing in completely opposite directions. England waited for news that never came. The boy's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, remained in sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, a queen dowager reduced to hiding in a church, unable to help her sons. She had surrendered her younger boy to the Tower weeks earlier, assured he would be safe and promised he would attend his brother's coronation. Now both her sons had vanished behind those walls, and no one would tell her anything. Their uncle sat on the throne. Richard III, formerly Duke of Gloucester, had been crowned king on July 6th. His nephews had been declared illegitimate, their claim to the throne nullified by Parliament. But illegitimate or not, they still existed. Or they had existed. Now even that was uncertain. Rumors spread through London within weeks of the coronation. Whispers in taverns and marketplaces. Gossip passed between servants. Speculation that reached the courts of Europe. The princes had been murdered. Richard had ordered it done. Or someone else had. Or they were still alive, smuggled out, and hidden away. No one knew anything concrete, but everyone was talking. Richard III never addressed the rumors directly. He never produced the boys to prove they lived. He never announced their deaths or gave them a royal funeral. He ruled for 2 more years, fought off one rebellion, and died at Bosworth Field in 1485, without ever explaining what had happened to his nephews. His successor, Henry VII, didn't explain either. The new Tudor king married the prince's sister, but never publicly accused Richard of murder. He never displayed bodies. He never provided closure. The uncertainty has persisted for over 5 centuries. We're still arguing about it today. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you believe these cold cases of history, these crimes that still demand answers after centuries of silence, deserve investigation, if you believe that the forgotten victims of the past deserve to have their stories told honestly, without the propaganda of the winners, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support keeps the candle lit. It allows us to keep exploring the places where history hides its secrets. Tonight, we investigate one of the most enduring mysteries in English history, and one that has seen explosive new developments in just the last 2 years. 2 children, heirs to the throne of England, walked into the Tower of London in 1483, and were never reliably seen again. For centuries, the accepted story was that their uncle Richard III had them murdered. Shakespeare dramatized it. The Tudors promoted it. Most people still believe it. But in 2023, Philippa Langley, the woman who found Richard III's body under a parking lot, claimed she had solved the case. Her conclusion? The princes survived. They escaped the Tower, fled to the continent, and returned years later to challenge Henry VII for the throne. The Tudors didn't just kill them, they erased them from history by branding them as imposters. Then in late 2024, Professor Tim Thornton announced a discovery that points in the opposite direction. Evidence linking the prince's personal possessions to the family of their alleged murderer. We now have new evidence on both sides. The mystery isn't solved. It is more contested than ever. We'll trace the prince's brief lives and examine the brutal politics that made their deaths convenient for everyone with power. We'll weigh the evidence for and against their uncle and against the Tudor king who replaced him. We'll examine the bones found in 1674 and ask why, when DNA testing could likely resolve decades of debate, every request to examine them has been denied. Welcome to Late Mysteries. The older prince was born into chaos in November 1470. His mother, Elizabeth Woodville, had fled to sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, heavily pregnant, while her husband, King Edward IV, was in exile. The Yorkist cause seemed lost. The Lancastrian King Henry VI had been restored to the throne. Elizabeth gave birth to her son in hiding, uncertain whether her husband would ever return, uncertain what future awaited a prince born to a deposed king. But Edward IV did return. He reclaimed his throne in 1471, killed the Lancastrian heir in battle, and likely ordered Henry VI's murder in the Tower. The Yorkist dynasty was secure again, and the infant Edward was heir to it all. The boy grew up at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border, sent there at age 3 to preside, nominally at least, over the Council of Wales. He had his own household, his own servants, his own tutors, preparing him for kingship. By all accounts, he was intelligent and serious, perhaps delicate in constitution, but sound in mind. He was being groomed for the crown from his earliest years. He was 12 years old when his father died unexpectedly in April 1483. He was proclaimed King Edward V immediately. He set out from Ludlow toward London for his coronation. He never arrived as a free king. His uncle intercepted him on the road, arrested his guardians, and took control of him. He entered London not riding in triumph, but in his uncle's custody. He was king for 77 days. He was never crowned. The younger prince had an easier childhood, at least at first. Born in 1473, Richard was the second surviving son, the spare, important, but not carrying the weight of expectation placed on his brother. While Edward was sent to Ludlow to learn governance, Richard stayed closer to home, raised in the royal household among his mother and sisters. He was, by the accounts that survive, a lively child, charming and confident, with the ease of a boy who had never experienced real adversity. He had already been married at age 5 to Anne Mowbray, daughter of a wealthy duke. Anne died young, leaving Richard a widower before he turned 10, but also leaving him claim to her family's substantial estates. He was 9 years old when the crisis came, too young to fully grasp the political maneuvering, too young to understand why his mother was so frightened, why she had fled with him into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, or why she wept when the archbishop came to negotiate his surrender. The council demanded that Richard join his brother in the Tower. For the coronation, they said. For company, they said. Elizabeth Woodville had no power to refuse. She surrendered her younger son in mid-June 1483, kissing him goodbye at the abbey door. She would never see him again. To understand why the princes mattered, you need to understand the family they came from and the enemies that family had made. Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville had made. Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville had 10 children who survived in the Tower. The 2 princes were the only surviving sons. Their 5 living sisters included Elizabeth of York, who would later become queen to Henry VII and mother to Henry VIII. The York family represented the future of the Yorkist dynasty, the heirs to everything Edward IV had fought for during the bloody Wars of the Roses. But the family was also a source of bitter, factional conflict. Elizabeth Woodville's marriage to the king had been controversial from the start. A commoner, widow of a Lancastrian knight no less, she had somehow captivated Edward IV so completely that he married her in secret. The marriage shocked the court and infuriated the king's chief advisor, the Earl of Warwick, who had been negotiating a French match. Worse, Elizabeth's relatives rose rapidly. Her father became an earl. Her brothers received titles and wealthy marriages. Her sons from her first marriage gained positions of influence. The Woodvilles accumulated power and enemies with every advancement. The old nobility resented these newcomers. Men who had bled for the Yorkist cause watched upstarts leap ahead of them in the king's favor. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward's loyal brother, reportedly clashed with the Woodvilles. The Duke of Buckingham despised them. When Edward IV died, leaving a 12-year-old heir surrounded by Woodville guardians, these resentments became lethal. Edward IV died on April 9, 1483, about 3 weeks before his 41st birthday. The death was unexpected. Edward had seemed healthy, still vigorous, still in the prime of his reign. Some accounts suggest he caught a cold while fishing on the Thames. Others mention a fever. Later writers would whisper about poison or about the toll of years of excessive eating and drinking. The cause remains uncertain. What was certain was the crisis his death created. The king was dead. The new king was a 12-year-old boy, 200 miles away at Ludlow Castle. A regency would be needed, someone to govern England until Edward V came of age. Edward IV had named his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector in his will. But the Woodvilles had other ideas. Elizabeth Woodville and her relatives understood their position perfectly. They controlled the young king. Edward IV's household at Ludlow was stuffed with Woodville allies. His governor was his maternal uncle, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, a cultured, intelligent man and a capable administrator. His half-brother Richard Grey was part of his retinue. The Woodvilles had the king, and they intended to keep him. They began planning an immediate coronation. If Edward V could be crowned quickly, before a formal regency was established, before Richard of Gloucester could arrive from the north, then the question of who controlled him would become moot. A crowned king didn't need a protector. A crowned king's relatives could govern in his name without interference. The council in London pushed back. They wanted a proper regency, a balanced government, not Woodville domination. But the Woodvilles had momentum. They had the king. They set the coronation for May 4th, just weeks away. They didn't move fast enough. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was not a man to be sidelined. He was Edward IV's youngest surviving brother, and, unlike their middle brother George, executed for treason in 1478, Richard had been loyal to Edward his entire adult life. He had fought for him, administered the North for him, and proven himself a capable military commander and a reliable ally. He had been rewarded with vast estates and enormous power in the north of England, where he was effectively a viceroy. He was also, according to Edward IV's will, supposed to be Lord Protector, the man who would govern England until the young king came of age. The Woodvilles' attempt to crown Edward V before Richard could arrive was a direct threat to his position, perhaps even to his life. Richard had a choice: let the Woodvilles sideline him or act first. He chose to act. Richard moved south from York. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, who had his own grievances against the Woodvilles, joined him. Together, they intercepted the young king's party at Stony Stratford on April 30th, before the royal entourage could reach London. What happened next was a coup in miniature. Richard arrested the Woodville escorts, Earl Rivers, Richard Grey, and Thomas Vaughan, men who had been Edward VI's guardians and companions for years. He accused them of plotting against him, of trying to destroy him and seize control of the government. Whether the accusations were true or simply useful has been debated ever since. The arrested men were sent north under guard. They would be executed without trial in late June. Richard took control of the king himself. Edward V, 12 years old, confused and possibly frightened, now rode toward London with his uncle, rather than his mother's family. The Woodvilles in London panicked. Elizabeth Woodville fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her youngest son and her daughters. The fleet that had been mustered for some unclear purpose dispersed. The planned coronation was postponed. Richard entered London on May 4th. the day Edward V was supposed to have been crowned. He came as protector. He came as the power behind the throne. The Tower of London in 1483 was not simply a prison. It was a fortress, certainly, and a place of execution for traitors. But it was also a royal residence. Traditionally, monarchs stayed there before their coronations. The complex included comfortable royal apartments, gardens, and even a menagerie of exotic animals. When Richard of Gloucester installed Edward V in the Tower in mid-May, it wasn't necessarily sinister. A coronation was being planned. The king needed appropriate lodging. The Tower was the traditional choice. The coronation was scheduled for June 22nd. Edward V would be crowned. A regency would govern until he came of age, and the crisis would be resolved. The young king waited in the royal apartments, attended by servants, visited by physicians, seemingly safe. At first, this could be seen as normal. Elizabeth Woodville remained in sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her younger children, including 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York. Sanctuary was a powerful medieval protection. Anyone who reached consecrated ground could not be lawfully removed by force. Elizabeth understood that as long as she held her younger son, she held a card. Richard of York was second in line to the throne. If anything happened to Edward V, the younger boy became king. But sanctuary couldn't last forever. The council, now firmly controlled by Richard of Gloucester, pressured Elizabeth to surrender the boy. They argued that the Duke of York should attend his brother's coronation. They claimed it was unhealthy for him to remain cooped up in the abbey. They promised he would be safe. Elizabeth resisted for weeks, but she had no real power, no army, and no allies capable of defying the protector. On June 16, 1483, she surrendered Richard to the Archbishop of Canterbury. The 9-year-old was escorted to the Tower to join his brother. The boys were together now, both sons of Edward IV, both heirs to the York dynasty, both entirely in their uncle's power. The coronation scheduled for June 22nd didn't happen. It was postponed, then postponed again. Meanwhile, Richard of Gloucester was consolidating control, removing potential opponents, and positioning his own allies in key positions. Something was building toward a conclusion that had nothing to do with crowning Edward V. On June 22nd, the day that should have seen a king crowned, a sermon was preached at St. Paul's Cross instead. Dr. Ralph Shaw, a theologian, stood before a crowd and made an astonishing claim. Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. The king had been pre-contracted, essentially engaged, to another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler, before he married Elizabeth in secret. If true, this meant the Woodville marriage was bigamous. The children born from it were illegitimate. Edward V was not the rightful king. Richard of Gloucester was. The claim came from Robert Stillington, Bishop of Bath and Wells, who said he had personally witnessed Edward IV's earlier engagement to Lady Eleanor Butler. Was it true? The evidence is murky at best. Eleanor Butler was conveniently dead. She had died in 1468, 15 years before the crisis, and couldn't confirm or deny anything. No documentation of the alleged pre-contract survives. Stillington had reasons to curry favor with Richard, having been imprisoned during Edward IV's reign. But truth mattered less than political reality. Parliament accepted the claim. An assembly of lords and commons petitioned Richard to take the throne. On July 6, 1483, Richard III was crowned King of England. Edward V, the boy who had been king for 77 days, was now just Edward, one of two illegitimate sons of the previous king. He and his brother remained in the Tower, no longer heirs, no longer politically vital, no longer seen. After Richard III's coronation, the princes were glimpsed less and less frequently. The Italian visitor Dominic Mancini, who left England in July 1483, reported that the boys had been withdrawn into the inner chambers of the Tower. Their servants had been dismissed. They were seen occasionally shooting and playing in the garden, but increasingly rarely. A physician named Dr. John Argentine reportedly the last outsider to see Edward V, gave a troubling account. The former king, Argentine said, was making daily confession like a victim preparing for sacrifice. The 13-year-old knew something was wrong. He understood he was in danger. The exact date when the boys were last seen is uncertain. Different accounts place it anywhere from late July to early September 1483. What's clear is that by autumn, no one credible claimed to have seen them at all. The windows where they had once appeared remained dark. The gardens where they had played stood empty. Richard III's court continued as if the boys had never existed. Within weeks of the coronation, rumors spread across England and into Europe. The princes had been murdered. They had been smothered in their beds. They had been drowned. They had been poisoned. The methods varied with the teller, but the conclusion was consistent. Richard III had ordered his nephews killed to secure his throne. The French chancellor publicly accused Richard of murdering the boys as early as January 1484. The accusation reached the courts of Spain, Burgundy, and the Italian states. By the time Richard died at Bosworth in August 1485, the belief that he had killed the princes was widespread, though not universal. Richard himself never confirmed anything. He never produced the boys to disprove the rumors. He never announced their deaths, never displayed bodies, and never held funerals. This silence has been read as evidence of guilt by many historians. An innocent man, they argue, would simply have shown the princes were alive. But there are other explanations for the silence, including the possibility that Richard genuinely didn't know what had happened to them, or that they were no longer in the tower at all. Whether Richard killed the princes or not, his silence made a certain brutal sense. Consider his position. If the boys were dead, admitting it would brand him a child killer before the world. Even in an age accustomed to political violence, the murder of children provoked horror. Richard's claim to the throne rested on their illegitimacy, but illegitimate children could be re-legitimized. Dead nephews were a different kind of problem entirely. If the boys were alive, producing them created different dangers. They would become rallying points for anyone who wanted to challenge Richard's rule. Every discontented noble, every Woodville loyalist, every foreign power looking to meddle in English affairs could claim to meddle in English affairs, could claim to champion the true king against the usurper. Silence allowed Richard to avoid both traps. Let the rumors swirl. Let the uncertainty persist. Neither confirm nor deny. It was politically defensible, if morally corrosive. The problem was that silence fed the worst assumptions. And when Henry Tudor came to take the throne, the vanished princes became a weapon against the man who had last held them. The traditional suspect is Richard III, and the case against him is straightforward. He had motive. The princes, even declared illegitimate, were threats to his throne. Parliament could reverse its own ruling. A successful rebellion could restore Edward V. As long as the boys lived, Richard's position was vulnerable. He had opportunity. The princes were in the tower, guarded by his men, entirely in his power. No one could have reached them without his knowledge or permission. If they were killed in the tower, Richard either ordered it or allowed it to happen. He had precedent. Medieval kings who deposed rivals frequently arranged for those rivals to die in custody. Edward II, Richard II, and Henry VI all met their ends as prisoners. Richard III would simply have been following a grim tradition, and he had the silence. A man falsely accused of murdering children who could disprove the accusations simply by producing them alive would surely do so. Richard never did. For 5 centuries, this logic has convinced most historians that Richard III killed his nephews. Shakespeare made him a monster. The Tudor dynasty made him a villain. Even today, with Richard's reputation partially rehabilitated, the majority of scholars believe he was responsible, but most likely is not certainly. And the case against Richard has always rested more on inference than evidence. Strip away Shakespeare, strip away Tudor propaganda, and Richard III looks different. He was loyal to his brother, Edward IV, for their entire adult lives, unlike their middle brother George of Clarence, who betrayed Edward twice and was executed for it. Richard administered the north of England effectively and justly, earning genuine popularity in a region that would remain loyal to his memory for generations. He was a competent military commander, a pious man who founded colleges and churches, a believer in legal reform who established the Council of the North and championed the rights of the poor. None of this proves he didn't kill the princes, but it complicates the portrait of a motiveless monster. There's also the question of timing. Richard's position was most vulnerable immediately after his coronation, in July and August 1483. If he was going to kill the princes, that would have been the moment to do it, before opposition could crystallize, before rumors could spread. But Richard didn't secure his throne by killing them. He faced Buckingham's rebellion in October 1483, a serious threat that nearly succeeded, without ever producing the princes' bodies to prove they were no longer a rallying point. Why not? If he had killed them, displaying proof would have ended the uncertainty. If he hadn't, producing them alive would have disproved the rumors. His silence makes sense only if he didn't control the answer. If the boys were neither certainly dead nor certainly in his hands. The man who actually benefited most from the prince's disappearance was Henry Tudor. Henry's claim to the English throne was weak. He descended from the illegitimate Beaufort line, barred from the succession by Act of Parliament. His victory at Bosworth in 1485 was achieved partly because Richard III charged recklessly into battle and was killed, and partly because key lords switched sides at the crucial moment. Henry became king by conquest, not by right. He married Elizabeth of York, the prince's eldest sister, uniting the Yorkist and Lancastrian claims. But as long as the princes lived or were believed to live, they had a stronger claim than Henry did. Even if they were illegitimate under Richard's ruling, Parliament could reverse that. Even if they were dead, their status as potential martyrs could fuel opposition. Henry VII's behavior after taking the throne is curious. He reversed the act that had declared the princes illegitimate. But he never accused Richard III of murdering them. Not in his formal indictments, not in his propaganda, and not in any official document. He attainted Richard for tyranny and other crimes, but not for killing children. Why not? If Richard had murdered the princes, accusing him would have been a propaganda gift. Unless Henry couldn't prove it, unless he wasn't certain what had happened, unless he had reasons of his own to keep the matter murky, or unless Henry himself had arranged their deaths after Bosworth and couldn't accuse Richard without risking exposure. There's a third suspect who deserves consideration: Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham was Richard III's closest ally during the seizure of power. He had helped intercept the young Edward V, supported Richard's claim to the throne, and been rewarded with enormous grants of land and power. He was, for a few months, the second most powerful man in England. Then, in October 1483, just 3 months after Richard's coronation, Buckingham rebelled. He raised an army in Wales, declared for Henry Tudor, and attempted to overthrow the king he had just helped crown. The rebellion failed. Buckingham was captured and executed. Why did he turn so quickly? The traditional explanation is that he learned Richard had killed the princes and was horrified. But there are other possibilities. Buckingham had his own distant claim to the throne. Perhaps he killed the princes himself, hoping to destabilize Richard. Perhaps he tried to use them as bargaining chips, and the plan went wrong. Perhaps he discovered they were already dead and saw no future in supporting their alleged murderer. Buckingham knew something. Whatever it was, it drove him from loyal ally to rebel within weeks. The answer died with him. The most detailed account of the prince's murders comes from Sir Thomas More, writing around 1513. 30 years after the events, More's history of King Richard III describes the killing in vivid detail. Richard III, he claims, sent a message to Sir Robert Brackenbury, Constable of the Tower, ordering him to kill the boys. Brackenbury refused. Richard then turned to Sir James Tyrrell, who agreed to the task. Tyrrell rode to London, took command of the Tower for one night, and supervised the murder. The actual killing, Moore says, was done by two men, Miles Forrest, a Tower official, and John Dighton, Tyrrell's horsekeeper. They smothered the boys in their beds, then buried the bodies at the foot of a staircase. Later, supposedly, the bodies were moved to a more appropriate location, though Moore claims not to know where. It's a compelling narrative. It has names, details, and a clear sequence of events. It's also completely unverifiable. Moore was a child when the princes disappeared. His sources were secondhand at best, memories collected years after the fact, possibly from people with their own agendas. He was writing under Henry VIII, a Tudor king with every reason to want Richard III painted as a villain. And he never finished the work. It was published posthumously. We cannot take Moore's account as fact, but we also cannot dismiss it entirely. Recent discoveries suggest he may have had access to better sources than previously believed. In 1502, Sir James Tyrrell was arrested for treason, not for the prince's murder, but for supporting a Yorkist pretender. He was executed that year. Before his death, according to Tudor sources, Tyrrell confessed to arranging the prince's murder on Richard III's orders. This confession supposedly confirmed the basic outline of Moore's account. There's a problem. We don't have the confession. No text survives. No record of what Tyrrell actually said exists. We have only the Tudor government's claim that he confessed, announced after his death when he could neither confirm nor clarify. A confession extracted under torture, kept secret from a man who was about to be executed regardless of what he said, proves nothing. But it also can't be entirely dismissed, especially in light of evidence discovered in 2024 that connects Tyrrell's family to the prince's personal possessions. Strip away the later accounts, the confessions, and the accusations, and what can we say for certain? The princes were in the Tower in summer 1483. Multiple reliable witnesses saw them there. They were seen less frequently after Richard III's coronation in July. By autumn 1483, credible sightings had ceased. Richard III never produced them. Henry VII never produced them. No one ever produced them. Those are facts. Everything else, who killed them, how, when, or whether they were killed at all, is inference, speculation, or propaganda. But in the last decade, new evidence has emerged. In 1487, 2 years after Henry VII took the throne, a boy appeared in Ireland claiming to be a Yorkist prince. The official Tudor account says he was Lambert Simnel, the son of an Oxford tradesman, coached by a priest named Richard Simons to impersonate Edward, Earl of Warwick, a different royal prisoner. Simnel led an invasion of England, which ended at the Battle of Stoke in June 1487. Simnel was captured, and Henry VII didn't execute him. He put him to work in the royal kitchens. This mercy has been read as evidence that Simnel was obviously a fake, but if he was actually who he claimed to be, keeping him alive as a servant might have been the smarter play. The more serious threat came in 1490, when a young man appeared at the court of Burgundy claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger prince, escaped from the Tower. He called himself Richard Plantagenet. He said he had been spared when his brother Edward was killed, smuggled out of the Tower, and hidden abroad for years. He had the bearing of a prince, spoke multiple languages, and knew details of the English court that an impostor shouldn't have known. Margaret of Burgundy publicly accepted him as her nephew. King James IV of Scotland and the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian also recognized him. Perkin, as the Tudors called him, launched multiple invasions of England. All failed. He was eventually captured in 1497 and executed in 1499. Before his death, he confessed to being an impostor, the son of a Flemish boatman named Jean de Verbeck. But confessions extracted from prisoners facing execution are inherently suspect. We don't have Perkin's own uncoerced account. We have only what the Tudors wanted the world to believe. In 1674, workmen demolishing a staircase in the Tower of London made a grim discovery. Beneath the stones, in a wooden chest, lay the bones of two children. The location matched Thomas More's account. He had written that the princes were buried at the stairfoot. The bones appeared to be the right size for children, roughly the ages the princes would have been. It seemed like confirmation. After nearly 200 years, the princes had been found. King Charles II ordered the bones treated as royal remains. They were placed in an urn designed by Christopher Wren and interred in Westminster Abbey. In 1933, the urn was opened for scientific examination. The analysis was limited by the technology of the time. The bones appeared to be from two children, one older than the other, matching the princes' ages of around 12 and 9 or 10. We could almost certainly resolve the question today. DNA testing technology has advanced enormously since 1933. We have comparison samples through their sister Elizabeth of York, whose descendants include the current British royal family. We could determine whether the bones are related to the Yorkist line and approximately when the individuals died. The bones in Westminster Abbey could tell us whether they're the princes or two unrelated children. Multiple historians and scientists have requested permission to test them. Every request has been denied. The Church of England controls access to the abbey and its tombs. Their position has been that the remains should be allowed to rest in peace, that the mystery doesn't justify disturbing a royal grave, and that we should accept the identification made in the 17th century. Critics argue that we owe it to the princes and to history to find out the truth. The debate continues. The bones remain sealed, and the mystery that DNA could potentially solve remains unsolved because someone decided not to try. In 2012, Philippa Langley achieved something remarkable. She located the lost grave of Richard III under a parking lot in Leicester. After the reburial in 2015, Langley turned her attention to the other great mystery of Richard's reign: what happened to his nephews. She assembled an international team called the Missing Princes Project. In November 2023, after 8 years of research, Langley announced her findings. Her conclusion was explosive. Both princes had survived. The first key discovery came from the archives of northern France. In Lille, Langley's team found an accounting receipt dated December 16, 1487, 6 months after the Battle of Stoke. The receipt records a payment for weapons for Margaret's nephew, the son of King Edward, who was expelled from his dominion. If this refers to Edward V, he was alive in late 1487, 4 years after he supposedly died. The second discovery came from the Netherlands. In November 2020, a 4-page document in the Gelders Archief in Arnhem was found. Written in Middle Dutch, it appears to be a witness statement from someone claiming to be Richard, Duke of York. He describes leaving sanctuary as a 9-year-old, being taken to the Tower, and surviving to arrive at his Aunt Margaret's court in 1493. Based on these and other findings, Philippa Langley argues that Lambert Simnel was actually Edward V, and Perkin Warbeck was truly Richard, Duke of York. In this reading, the princes weren't murdered. They were spirited out of the Tower and survived to challenge the Tudor usurper. Henry VII didn't just defeat them militarily, he erased them from history, replacing princes with pretenders in the official record. It's a stunning revision that has provoked fierce debate. Not everyone accepts Langley's conclusions. Critics point out that the Lille receipt doesn't name Edward V explicitly, and that Margaret of Burgundy had every political reason to support pretenders. The Missing Princes Project, they argue, started with a conclusion and worked backward. Then, in November 2024, new evidence emerged pointing in the opposite direction. Professor Tim Thornton announced he had found the 1516 will of Margaret Capel, a London widow. Among the bequests was an extraordinary item, the personal chain of King Edward V. Edward V's chain would have been unmistakably his, a badge of identity and status. Why did Margaret Capel have the dead king's chain? Margaret was the sister-in-law of Sir James Tyrrell, the man who allegedly confessed to arranging the prince's murders. If the princes had been murdered and Tyrrell had organized the killing, the chain might have been kept as proof, a trophy or a receipt. There's another connection. Margaret's husband employed a lawyer named John Moore, the father of Sir Thomas More. The chain connects Tyrrell's family to Edward V's possessions, and the lawyer connects the family to the man who would tell the murder story. We are now in an extraordinary position. Philippa Langley presents archival evidence suggesting survival, while Tim Thornton presents archival evidence suggesting they were killed. Both findings are genuine archival discoveries. They cannot both be correct. Either the princes survived, or they were killed and their possessions distributed among those responsible. The new evidence doesn't resolve the mystery, it deepens it. What we need is DNA testing of the Westminster bones. That could tell us whether the children were royal and male, and whether they died as children at all. Whatever happened to the princes, we shouldn't lose sight of who they were. Edward was 13, old enough to understand he was in danger. Dr. Argentine's account describes him preparing himself spiritually for sacrifice. He had been king for 77 days. Richard was 9, old enough to sense that something was wrong. Contemporary accounts describe him as charming and lively. He had been taken from his mother's arms with a promise of safety. Whatever happened to him, he deserved none of it. This is what makes the mystery so persistent. It's not just a historical puzzle, it's about a pair of brothers who trusted the adults around them and were betrayed. Every generation returns to this story because the horror of it doesn't fade. Children in danger. Children disappeared. Children whose fate remains unknown. We argue about Richard III and Henry VII, but underneath all the analysis, there is the reality of two brothers who should have had lives, marriages, and children of their own. After 500 years, certain things remain genuinely unknowable. We don't know when the princes died, who was responsible, or if the Westminster bones are theirs. What we can say with confidence is that the story we inherited was written by the Tudors. For over a century, the Tudors controlled what was remembered and taught. They had every reason to paint Richard III as a monster to justify their own weak claim. That doesn't mean Richard was innocent, but it means we should read the sources critically. The truth is buried somewhere beneath the propaganda. There is one thing that could shift the balance: testing the Westminster bones. If DNA analysis showed the bones were royal, it would support the traditional account. If they turned out to be unrelated, it would blow the case wide open. The current situation serves no one except those who prefer mystery to resolution. If anyone deserves final answers, the princes do. The Tower of London is a tourist attraction now. Millions of visitors walk through its gates, but somewhere within those walls, something happened that we still don't understand. In Westminster Abbey, a small marble urn keeps its secrets. It is a monument to uncertainty, a grave that might not contain who it claims to contain. Perhaps that's fitting. The prince's whole story is built on gaps and silences. All we can do is keep looking, keep asking, and keep trying to give them the ending their story deserves. We'll see you next time.